Hello, it's Cindy from the Osterville Library, and today we're here with everybody's favorite author, Anthony Sammarco. He has written so many books, it's hard to keep track. Every time I see a post, he has a new one coming out. But this one is so timely now, Easter Traditions in Boston, and I'm sure it's going to be another fabulous talk by Anthony, so welcome and happy Easter.
Thank you very much. I think in a lot of ways it's one of those traditional things that we think about Easter. And this is a book in the Traditions in Boston series that I've begun writing. A couple of years ago, I did Christmas traditions in Boston, and last fall, I did Thanksgiving traditions in Boston. Well, Easter traditions in Boston came out last month, and I've already finished Valentine's Day traditions in Boston that'll be out for 2022. But like the books that I've written in the past, which are history books on Boston and the neighborhoods and surrounding cities and towns, I've begun a new series with Fonthill. And Fonthill Press is in London. They do beautiful books, but they're in color, which makes it all the more important. Local history is fun, but so too aren't the traditions we share. And Easter, which is both a religious and secular holiday, is something that has evolved not just in the past as a religious holiday that we, of course, proclaim that Jesus has risen from the dead, but in the period of the 20th century, Boston began to see many traditions, such as the Easter parade and, of course, the wonderful flower shows that actually were done. And this book, which basically was just printed, shows three little girls staring covetously at their candy baskets on Easter Sunday morning. Beautifully dressed, beautiful Easter bonnets, and both chocolate as well as hard-boiled eggs that have been colored. You began to realize in the mid-20th century, this was what it was all about. But Easter, as I said, is not just a secular holiday, it's a religious one. The very first chapter that I do in this book I call Ecce Homo, and I talk about Jesus Christ, and of course the week leading up to his crucifixion on Good Friday. And seen here at the very beginning of the Holy Week, Christ carrying the cross, which was painted in 1505 by Andrea Solario, is a great example of the turmoil and travail that Jesus was entailing, not just carrying his cross to his ultimate crucifixion, but also crowned with thorns. And we look at this painting, which is over 500 years old, and we realize the anguish that's on the tear-stained face of Jesus Christ and what would go on for the entire week. Well, during that period, Christ had actually been not just tortured, but he was even given interrogations. And this painting, done by Gerard von Horst, was Christ before the high priest, painted in the early 17th century. He's actually interrogated by one of the rabbis. And we see men in the distance with a center candle showing not only the face of Jesus illuminated by that candle, and whether or not it's good versus evil, but we realize in this instance, the false testimony that was given against him was something that would eventually lead to his crucifixion. This painting is one of the most eloquent that shows Jesus Christ with the crown of thorns. Done in the very early 17th century by Matthias Storm, this is something that not only shows Jesus in the red cape, but also the crown of thorns bleeding from his forehead and face. It's a naturalistic and very dramatic painting. We began to realize it's not just, as you see on the left, the rabbi, the man in the center who is the Roman centurion, and the man on the right-hand side simply holding a candle, but in medieval dress. You began to realize the strong effect of the light and the dark, the good and the evil that actually was emanating at that period. One of my very favorite paintings of Jesus has always been Christ and Thorns by Karl Bloch. Bloch was a German painter of the 19th century, and it was said at the time that he was probably the most eloquent and well-versed painter of religious scenes in the world. This painting showing Christ with thorns, and of course we see him still in that red cape, is not only an anguished face, but it's something in some ways that transcends time. And this painting could be something that we would have seen today as well as at the time of the crucifixion. And of course, Christ Crucified, done in 1632 by Diego Velázquez, is something that shows the ultimate aspect of his crucifixion after having been given up to the people by Pontius Pilate. If you notice, there's a very gentle halo around Jesus's head. And of course, he's not only nailed to the cross, but we realize with his head lowered and his cuts and bruises and bleeding from various spots, we realize in some ways that this was something that was not only prophesied, but was one of the most tremendous things. He may have been crucified and he may have died, but he rose from the dead on Easter Sunday morning. And the resurrection, also by Karl Bloch, done in 1881, shows Jesus arising from the tomb. He is risen. And we see angels on either side with the white Madonna lilies, the sign of purity, as Jesus ascends to heaven. He is victorious over death. And we realize in that instance that, yes, this is a religious holiday, and it is the reason that we celebrate Easter. But it's also something that has actually become, in some ways, not just an adult, but even a child type holiday. Children love it. But you would realize throughout the centuries, Easter was somewhat practiced by Roman Catholics as well as Protestants, but it would only be in the period of the late 17th and very early 18th century that Boston would begin to see any type of celebration for Easter. During the period of King William and Queen Mary in 1689, when they had the Glorious Revolution, they would actually have a more religious, tolerant reign. And they would see not just Puritanism in Boston. You had to realize Puritans were actually members of the Church of England, but they purified it from within. And we saw no trappings of anything of Anglicanism, let alone Roman Catholicism. And following James II, who was also James VII of Scotland, was somebody who instituted religious tolerance during his reign. He would appoint royal governors to Massachusetts Bay Colony, and his representative was Sir Edmund Andros. This man in the late 17th century was appointed the royal governor of the Dominion of New England. And when he came to New England as an Anglican and as the representative of the king, he actually instituted Anglican worship. In that instance, he actually used the Old South Meeting House, which was something in a lot of ways that you began to realize had been built in the period and used as a place of worship by the Puritans. He not only had the bells tolled for those to go to Anglican service, but it really was the first instance of actually seeing a difference from the Puritan religion. And during that period, we began to see not just Anglicans, but Roman Catholics, Huguenots, Baptists, and Quakers, all beginning to have a more religious tolerance from the king, and of course, New England. Well, in that instance, one of my ancestors, Samuel Sewall, who was a judge of the province of Massachusetts Bay, he was also one of the judges of the Salem witchcraft trial, was somebody who was somewhat of an ignorant man who not only disdained Christmas, but he also disdained Easter. Any religious holiday was blocked in his calendar, and Sewall's diaries, which are really quite extensive, talk about not just his daily life, but also how New England was changing between the period of William and Mary and James II, but the aspect of the lessening of the Puritan aspect of Boston. Well, the whole thing in the 19th century would come to Boston. And why did Easter become something that was celebrated? Well, beginning in the 1820s to the 1860s, Boston was experiencing tremendous changes. It wasn't just topographical and, of course, matriculation, but it was also the fact that we saw immigrants coming to the New World and settling sometimes in Boston. It went the gamut from the Irish in the 1840s to the Germans in the 1850s to Russian Jews in the 1870s, and of course, a plethora of other religions. Not only these religions, ethnicities, and races would actually see many people coming to Boston, but they brought their traditions with them. Well, this man was Louis Prang. Prang was from Germany. He arrived in 1848, and he was a well-known printer. And he actually set up a printing press in Boston. But by the period of the 1860s, he began to offer chromolithography, which was something that would allow a card to be printed in a multitude of colors, all from different stones that were dipped into different colored paints. And Louis Prang himself was somebody who would actually create these Prang's Easter cards. They were very expensive because the paper itself, which was plain, would actually have an overlay of every single color. And you might have 11 different colors that would create this one thing. Well, here we have Jesus, and this is 1875, surrounded by Madonna lilies. And you see, of course, the wonderful radiating Holy Father directly above. But Prang's cards were some of the best that were available in the United States. Now, he did introduce the first Christmas card to the United States, and that was in 1872. But by the period of the mid-1870s, it wasn't just Christmas cards and various greeting cards, but even Easter cards. His factory, which still stands on Meeting House Hill in Roxbury, Massachusetts, was a magnificent building that he had over 120 employees. And the surprising thing is, it was a 60% ratio of women. Women were not just employed as artists, but also colorists, and they would also even write the verse that was in the card itself. And this card, called the Easter Lily Cross, was done just after the Civil War, and it was done by a woman named Olive Whitney, a very well-known artist of that period. And she was not just a chromolithographic artist, but she would paint these that could then be translated into chromolithography. It was something that not only showed the Madonna's lilies and the lilies of the valley, but it was very integral to the fact of many people having still mourned the loss of their husbands and fathers and brothers and sons in the Civil War. But Louis Prang did this one card, and this is one of my favorites, and I collected it many, many years ago, and it shows the angel at the tomb of Christ. Not only is it an impressive chromolithograph, but it shows you, in this instance, that the saint, or maybe it's an angel, but it does have a halo, actually holds a palm frond in one hand, and of course the color is just magnificent, with the butterflies directly around it and a border of stars. It's incredible. But the palm frond was something that was a symbol of victory, triumph, peace, and eternal life. And of course, this depicts he is risen. This may be an angel, but Jesus has risen from the dead. But Louis Prang also introduced the flower of language, the language of flowers. And seen here, this was a card that was done probably in 1881, and it was the bells of Easter. Well, the bells of Easter were the bluebells, and it was a flower long associated with the everlasting love and constancy. Bluebells are said to be a favorite with the woodland fairies, and it's a sure sign of spring when they've arrived. But this was something that not only had a beautiful chromolithographic picture of bluebells, but he also does a wonderful verse that was actually a Vesper hymn that was composed by Dmitry Boratansky. Each of these, in some ways, brought the fact of religion, but by the period of the late 19th century, we also saw other artists introducing the bunny rabbit. And the bunny rabbit was always thought by Germanic culture to not only bring colored Easter eggs, but he actually would lay them during the period just before Easter. Well, this bunny has come equipped. Look at the wicker basket on his back, all sorts of colored eggs, and he uses as a walking stick a pussy willow twig. They're beautifully done, and in some ways, this Easter egg is hatching directly in front of the Easter bunny, and what child would not believe that the Easter bunny had brought those eggs? It was a great example, and it was actually an evolution of shared ethnicities and ethnic beliefs. So much so that by the early part of the 20th century, many of the well-known printing card companies, such as Hallmark, Rustcraft, Norcross, Gibson, and American Greeting Cards, would actually produce millions of Easter cards that would only be sold in the month just before Easter. Many of them were done by known artists, and this is Tasha Tudor. Tasha Tudor is an interesting woman. Her real name is Starling Burgess. She was born on Beacon Hill, the great-granddaughter of Frederick Tudor, the Ice King of Boston. And that's her great-grandmother, Euphemia Tudor, actually in the portrait. But Tasha Tudor, born to great wealth, was somebody in a lot of ways that actually embraced the life of the 1830s. She lived in a house without heat. She did have running water, but she dressed in a period of the 1830s with headscarves and older dresses. And in some ways, as her writing took off, she became so well known that her books on corgi dogs would actually number over 100. she illustrated her books from her own art collection. And seen here, her Happy Easter card was something that showed her children around the Easter egg tree, something that had chicken eggs, duck eggs, swan eggs, and even at the top, plover eggs, robin's eggs, and all sorts of different things that would actually be colored. So something that she did with her children and grandchildren. And we realize in some ways that Tasha Tudor was just like most of the artists of that period. One of the other artists was Norman Rockwell on the left-hand side. Rockwell was a chronicler of 1950s, 1960s America. It didn't matter who you were, what cross-section of life, he somewhat portrayed everyone. And he was one of the artists that actually produced paintings that would be used on greeting cards. He's speaking with Joyce Hall, who was the founder of Hallmark Cards. You might remember the adage, if you care to send the very best, of course, one would send Hallmark cards. Well, Joyce Hall had dozens of artists, and today Hallmark Cards has a collection of some of the most wonderful paintings that were done for the greeting cards. One of my very favorites is by Norman Rockwell, shows this family on Easter Sunday morning in 1959. The mother with her two daughters, obviously twins, and her young son are dressed in their Easter finery headed for church. And the father, who's in his bathrobe and jammies and is smoking behind the paper, is someone that doesn't seem to be ready, if even going to church that morning. Well, in a lot of ways, it's a funny thing. It gives us a little bit of a chuckle, but if you look closely behind that smoke, Norman Rockwell has painted the father with two horns coming from his hairdo. So he was someone who was not only an interesting man and created a secular holiday card, but he was like Edward Winslow Rust, who created Rust Craft. And Rust Craft, which was one of the leading greeting card companies of the 20th century, did more traditional cards, such as this, Easter greetings to a special friend. And this little kitty cat pops from a tall-ware teapot, and you realize in some ways that it's not only charming, but this was something that had one of the longest artists that had been employed by Rustcraft, Mary Cooper, providing something that was a traditional piece of tallware with a charming cat. But there was also Norcross greeting cards that would later merge with Rustcraft, and we realized that it was founded by a brother and a sister, and they themselves would actually create more traditional cards as well. Well, she created this wonderful Easter lily card. It's from the 1930s, and it's somewhat Art Nouveau, but this is actually a piece of satin that's actually been printed upon. And you realize in that way, with not only the font, but the lily, that it's something that gives the gamut from Tasha Tudor to Norman Rockwell to Rustcraft, now Norcross. Cards were an important feature, but I don't know about you, but when I was a child, we would color Easter eggs. 24 eggs, and they would have more color on us than there were on the eggs. But Flex had begun as early as 1889 offering certified Easter egg colors. And of course, they advertised it with an Easter bunny, top hat, spats, and cane, that you too could actually color the Easter eggs for an Easter basket. Well, by the period of the 1890s to 1900, Easter baskets were things that children began to look forward to. And it wasn't a very easy thing to color eggs. You would have, as you see here in the foreground, different colors actually having been diluted in water to allow you not only to dye the egg, but then, of course, you could even paint upon it. Well, this woman, and this is about 1945, actually is getting instruction from a chick that's on her shoulder. And you realize in some ways that with artificial grass, the eggs themselves would actually be laid in such a way that the children could actually eat them in the morning. And by the 1950s and 1960s, other companies such as RIT created an Easter egg coloring kit. This is actually a fun one because it actually can be dated to 1967 because it says Easter egg dress-ups for the moon visit. So we know that in that instance with the rocket on the upper right-hand side, that we're coloring eggs, but we're doing it in commemoration of the moon visit. And seen here, if I was actually coloring Easter eggs, I'd like a Smirnoff daiquiri as well. They were labor intensive. But in a lot of ways, it wasn't just the fact that Christmas cards and egg coloring companies advertised, so did liquor companies. And this couple actually enjoying, I hope they actually finished the eggs before they finished their daiquiri, have in the foreground Easter chocolates as well as you can see the colored eggs. Well, the whole idea is by the recent past, these children with their past Easter eggs actually are coloring them. And these are the great grandchildren of my mother's very best friend who had not only attended day school, but even graduated from Vassar with her. These children themselves, in some ways, are typical of our children and grandchildren. They color the eggs, and it's more fun sometimes to do than to eat. But the idea was, in some ways, that the 20th century interpretation of Easter did include, of course, Sunday services. But of course, a woman could not go to church without an Easter bonnet. And seeing here a woman, and this is a 1952 photograph, not only models a straw hat with enormous margarita daisies on it and a veil, but you also see around her dozens of hats. And it didn't matter if it was a hat shop or it was Woolworths or W.T. Grant. It seemed at that time everyone would actually offer Easter bonnets. Even here, Mrs. Lemire, a woman that lived in Milton, along with her young son, appeared at a hat shop in Quincy Square, and she wanted to choose just the right one. Of course, one went in a mink stole, but seen in the foreground, her 3-year-old son decided he wanted to wear one too, which was a lace and flower creation. Well, Easter bonnets included in some ways some pretty outre things. And this woman, who was a well-known newscaster, actually had artificial straw on her head, along with a real duck. I don't know if basically the duck quacked during services, but she looks cute, and you began to realize that some of these hats went over the top. And here in Boston, as well as in Provincetown, the Hat Sisters, on either side of the late Mayor Tom Menino, Mayor of Boston, were great examples of some of the more colorful and floral arrangements of hats. So whether one had a straw hat with a veil or flowers, it was something that was beautifully done. Well, in this instance, we began to realize that not only the period of the 20th century did we have traditional Easter morning services, but beginning in the 1920s and 1930s, there were many sunrise services. And this was Mount Hood in Melrose, Massachusetts. It was an ecumenical service, and it was said to have brought over 1,500 people. And it was done on an annual basis at the very top of Mount Hood that had an overlook of the entire city of Boston, which was only about 12 miles away. It was an important feature. It was actually done on WBZ radio, so it was actually broadcast. So we began to realize that this ecumenical service was, in a way, the precursor of our sunrise services today. And seen here at Castle Island in South Boston, Massachusetts, this is the Donald McKay Monument for the great shipbuilder from East Boston. But in the foreground, this is a Roman Catholic service of a sunrise service on Easter Sunday morning. And this is probably 2012. And you can see hundreds of people here as well. Well, whether we worship in church or we worship for the sunrise of Christ is risen, it's an important feature in that tradition if one believes Christ has risen. Well, in a lot of ways, the traditional church services have more people than the churches ever see on any other Sunday. I remarked to myself, even as a child, gee, I've never even seen some of these people. But here at Trinity Church in Boston's Copley Square, it is the oldest place of Episcopal worship in Boston, having been founded in 1732. There's also the Cathedral of the Holy Cross in Boston's South End, magnificent structure that was consecrated in 1877 and designed by Patrick Keeley. But we began to realize that there were some that were really quite unusual. Now, this is a very interesting photograph because it shows a group of people's names on the board. It was an electric board, and even the cross at the very top would be illuminated by electricity. And this was actually the Easter offering. And these two angels on either side with an electric rod would point to the cradle roll. And the first one would be Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet would stand in the congregation and she would verbally say what her Easter offering was. Well, there's no other way to say it. They were actually being taken in a way that they had to give verbally what they were going to give. And each one would go down and they would actually illuminate it. So at the end, they knew how much money the church was actually getting for an Easter Sunday service donation. But we also realized that after services, many people did share in a collation, but other people headed for the Easter parade. And this, which is actually a church called St. Cyprian's, which is in Boston South End, shows a grandfather with his granddaughter holding her Easter bunny. Not only are they well dressed, but the grandfather looks pretty dapper with his hat and cutaway and, of course, his morning trousers. But you also realize that many Bostonians would not only attend services, whether it was at Trinity or the Cathedral of the Holy Cross, but then they would march along the side streets to the Commonwealth Avenue Mall. Well, seen here, these two older women on the right-hand side are obviously sisters with one of their son and daughter, but they're all beautifully dressed, corsages, and of course, the man is in a top hat, cutaway, and of course, morning trousers. When they did arrive, they went to the parade. And the Easter parade was something that started in the 1920s. It was an important feature to realize that it brought people of all walks of life. And it wasn't just the people from Trinity Church, it was many Roman Catholics. And we would realize in some ways that the Easter parade was the parade to not only be seen parading, but to see while you paraded. On the right-hand side in a top hat is Governor Christian Herder, one of the governors of the Commonwealth, his wife, and their two children. They're well-dressed, but I mean, it looks typical of what one would have seen at Trinity Church any other Sunday of the week. But the concept was some of these people would really go the gamut, and they would dress beautifully. And this woman on Commonwealth Avenue is dressed in a wonderful fox stole. Her daughter is adorable, beautiful dress, bonnet and gloves. But look at the sons on the left-hand side. They're miniature gentlemen. They have top hats, Eton collars, cutaways, and morning trousers, along with a boutonniere. And you realized in some ways this was something that was really quite wonderful. And it was a copy of the 19th century Eton uniform. Eton itself is still a secondary school in Great Britain. And we realized that the young boys still wear this uniform on Sundays. Well, when they did arrive at the Easter parade, many people became well-known celebrities, such as the O'Neill family. The O'Neills lived in Jamaica Plain. They were Irish Roman Catholic, and after their Mass at Blessed Sacrament Church in Jamaica Plain, they would head into Boston, where the 11 daughters, dressed identically, would parade. And of course, their parents, seen on the far left-hand side, were not just proud of them, but they had only one son. Seen here, Mrs. O'Neill would actually sew every single outfit. She probably started the day after Easter because she had to do 12 outfits, including her own. But as you can see here, they're dressed in matching finery and became not only the pride of Boston, but they did this for over 13 years. And seen here in 1957, Mr. and Mrs. O'Neill, with their only son, is seen on the right-hand side, and the daughters, which have become somewhat older on the left-hand side, have now married. And you can see going from the left to the right is Jane O'Neill Deary, Barbara O'Neill Wampole, Maureen O'Neill Clunan, and then the children that are not married, Evelyn, Virginia, Mary, Julie, Danielle, Frances, and young Daniel O'Neill Jr. Mrs. O'Neill must have been very proud. She wears Stone Mountain furs, and her daughters look beautiful. And it became, in some ways, an important feature of every single Easter Day parade. But they weren't the only ones. There was also this family, the Houghtons from Somerville, Massachusetts. Mr. and Mrs. Houghton on either side of their daughters, with their young son on the right-hand side, would actually go to a dressmaker where they would actually have matching outfits made for Easter Sunday. And they too would actually parade on the Commonwealth Avenue Mall. Agnes Houghton herself was somebody who was well known in Somerville. And in that instance, her children themselves said that they remembered that in the beginning, their mother made their outfits. However, as more children were added to the family, that became difficult. So the mother found an elderly seamstress who lived nearby named Mrs. Church. And we would go to her house to discuss the outfits and be measured. And I remember going into Chinatown with my mother to purchase the fabric. Well, they look beautiful every year. And seen here, and this is 1967, the daughters wear these cape-like coats, white hats, and of course, dark shoes, and if you're young enough, actually ankle socks. But you began to realize it didn't matter who you were, you too could participate in the Easter Sunday parade. It didn't matter if one was rich or poor, but it was something that was a tradition that Bostonians embraced. And of course, Easter Sunday is nothing if one doesn't get an Easter basket. And seeing here that cover photograph, and this is the original, it was in black and white. I have to thank Jamie Sutton, one of the employees of Fonthill Press in London, who colorized it, showed the three beautiful little girls in their Easter bonnets staring at their baskets. We realize in some ways, whether it's chocolate candy or colored eggs, each one of them is special. And of course, it's only once a year. The other thing was, like Tasha Tudor, Easter egg trees was something that became very common in the period of the 1930s and 1940s. And these two children are in the children's reading room of the Brookline Public Library. It's 1950, and not only have they decorated an Easter egg tree, and these, of course, are hollow eggs that have then been dyed and sometimes even decorated, as you can see. In the foreground, standing on the table, is a book that was called The Easter Tree, and it was written by Catherine Milhouse. Not only did it talk about children finding Easter eggs in an attic that had been painted and colored by their grandmother, but it talks about them actually setting them up on the table to surprise her. And she won the Caldecott Medal in 1951 for the book. It's a charming book, and it's something that many children should actually read at the Easter holiday season. But during that period, candy was something in a lot of ways that many people looked forward to. I still do. And Schrafft's Chocolates was something that had been founded in 1867 by a man named Wilhelm Schrafft, a German immigrant. It was located initially in the North End and later moved to Sullivan Square in Charlestown, Massachusetts. And I had a great uncle that was a master candy dipper who could tell me the little flavors of every single candy by the squiggle on the top. But Schrafft's Chocolates, beautifully decorated for Easter, actually provided a wonderful hostess gift. Maybe you remember Fanny Farmer candies. Fanny Farmer had nothing to do with Fanny Farmer candies. Fanny Farmer was the great cook who actually invented, so to speak, not only recipes, but wrote a cookbook. Fanny Farmer actually utilized her name, and of course they had candy shops throughout New England in the period of the 20th century. But we also had Whitman's candy. And of course, Whitman's is something that, though it's a lower price candy, has in the very center of every single box, the messenger, the young man directly below the woman in her beautiful Easter bonnet, that's actually a piece of pure milk chocolate. And it's, of course, the season's most popular messenger. In a lot of ways, it was also flowers. And whether one purchased them on the street corner by many of these purveyors as one went to Easter Sunday dinner, these young children are what was called at Mahoney's Rocky Ledge when it first started in Winchester, Massachusetts. It was just down the street from where we lived. And in that instance, these young children actually are engulfed by Madonna lilies that are covering every aspect of the greenhouse itself. And holding these little Easter bunnies, you realize that the aroma of the Easter lily, and of course the anticipation of not just a candy and an Easter basket, but of course church services. Another person during that period that was really a role model was Tenley Albright. Tenley Albright was somebody who, when she became well known as a figure skater, and actually was quite well known, would eventually go on to Radcliffe, and she graduated and became a student at the Harvard Medical School. She became a renowned surgeon at the New England Baptist Hospital. But in the period of the 1960s, she became the Easter Seals representative. And this young child and she are actually kneeling beside her Porsche, if you can imagine. And they're putting an Easter Seal bumper sticker on the car. Of course, many people would gasp at that. But the idea was that Tenley Albright herself really took it seriously. And seen here at a women's luncheon for Easter, she herself was chairwoman, and she's presenting an Easter hat box to the woman on the right who actually had won the prize. So in a lot of ways, whether one was doing things for flowers or candy or raising money for Easter seals, Easter was something that came together as a family community aspect of dinner. Many people in some instances think of Norman Rockwell's painting Freedom from Want, which actually shows a mother and a father with an enormous turkey serving it to their family and friends. Well, seen here, mother and father serve a ham on Easter Sunday morning. And of course, it's something that shows how well-dressed people were in the 1960s. And ham might have been a choice, but Easter Sunday dinner might include this, Armour's Star Ham. My father was the vice president of Armour in the period of the 1950s and 1960s, and we were guinea pigs. My sister and I would always be used to test the new types of things that they actually offered. So whether it was cheese-stuffed hot dogs or hot dogs that had mustard already in them, or this one, which was an Easter ham for the 75th anniversary of Armour that actually had pre-stuck cloves in the ham itself, you began to realize that they were available at every supermarket. But other people might choose a chicken. And this is an Easter salute to the noblest roaster of them all. Remember, in the 1940s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt said that during the Depression, every American will have a chicken on Sundays, and many people did. And the Easter aspect of whether it was ham or a chicken or even a turkey or a roast beef was something that was special. And of course, Bird's Eye, seen here, didn't just offer the frozen chickens, but they also offered frozen vegetables. It's very easy to make dinner for people in a few minutes. But one of my beloved aspects of the Christmas as well as Easter shows was Julia Child. And Julia Child was somebody who actually could make French cooking easy, even for Americans. I remember a great aunt actually sitting every afternoon from 4 to 4:30 before she had her tea, watching Julia Child, and heaven forbid we ever spoke a word. The idea was Julia Child was a role model for many Bostonians who yearned to cook a la Francaise. Well, seen here in the foreground, she had a family of chickens. I guess Mr. and Mrs. Chicken are in the very center, along with the children chicken on either side. But we realized that the ham, when it was served, was something that was a beautiful cut. And this child, who has the largest eyes of mesmeration, of yams and peas with her glass of milk, along with her straw hat, it's typical of the children of the period of the 50s and 60s on Easter Sunday. Well, dessert on Easter is something that's also special. And seen here, Baker's Chocolate, which is the oldest manufacturer of chocolate in the United States, having been founded in 1765 in Dorchester Lower Mills, is something that can be combined with yellow cake mix to make an Easter egg cake. And when you cut it, it was a four-layered Easter cake, decorated with chocolate as well as jelly beans. And we realize also that Mrs. Duff, a woman whose family owned the Duff Gingerbread Mix Company, would actually show you how to make Easter bunnies out of gingerbread, as well as cookies that you could decorate to also place in an Easter basket. And in the period of the 1920s and 1930s, Duff's was one of the earliest of the packaged materials that allowed you to make gingerbread or cornbread or even such things as pie crust. It was easy, quick, and inexpensive, but Duff's had the best gingerbread mix on the market at that time. Well, in a lot of ways, when we think of Easter, many of us do think of the religious aspect. Services on Easter morning are an important feature. But we realized that afterwards, one might have taken that stroll along the Commonwealth Avenue Mall. This is 1979. But the whole aspect is that Easter is a shared aspect. It's not just a holiday we celebrate, but we celebrate it with family and friends. And we realize that it's even Mrs. Mallard, along with her entire troop of wonderful ducklings, that was immortalized in Make Way for Ducklings by Officer McCluskey, that we realize that they too have their Easter bonnets and little knit scarves at their necks. This, by Nancy Schoen, a very well-known sculptor, is a great example of how we translate that aspect of Easter into some ways that we share as both a religious and a secular holiday. And in that way, I've tried to incorporate all of these traditions, both your memories and mine, into a book that I called Easter Traditions in Boston. When this book was published, I think it's an important feature to realize it chronicles in photographic format, with over 70% of the photographs in color, the whole aspect of not just Jesus during his Holy Week travails and the eventual crucifixion and the rising from the dead, but also how we celebrate Christmas in the United States. Christmas, I should say, Easter in the United States. But in that way, it's an important way to realize that our shared traditions, our shared memories make us in some ways cognizant of how important the holiday is.
Well, Anthony, was just amazing. You brought up so many memories and so many great points. I just love the artwork was incredible, and the whole story of how everything evolves. It's amazing, all the research and work that you do that goes into these books.
Thank you. It's fun. I think in a lot of ways, this is something that really and truly people can relate to, but it's also something we can show our children and grandchildren how we, our parents and grandparents, actually had celebrated Easter. I think
you can check out the book at the library, but how can people buy this book also?
If people would like to buy a book and they were actually around the Osterville Village Library, they can leave their name at the library, or they can email me. My name is Anthony Sammarco, so the email is asammarco@msn.com. So it's ASA, as in Mary, ARCO @msn.com. Send me an email, and if you're within the Cape, the price is $24, and if you'd like one mailed, it's $28.
Well, that's great. Well, I thank you so much for taking this time with us this morning and sharing this great new book.
Thank you very much, Cindy.